I'm Dr. Dave Caudell. I'm the Executive Director of the Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation. And I'm also a physicist and an autism self-advocate. I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Now, what this means is that in some fundamental ways, my brain is wired differently from most people. And that means that what works well for the group, what works well for most folks, might not necessarily work well for me or might actually be harmful. And so today in this video, I'd like to tackle the concepts of accommodations. First, let's focus on the misconception that the word accommodations brings. All humans need accommodations, except we often don't think about them as accommodations. For example, we know that in professional settings, there are certain ways that you're supposed to act. And there's certain types of language that you're supposed to do. This is an accommodation because if you are verbally abusive to your students or your colleagues, this can cause a lot of issues. It can cause some mental health issues. And so to accommodate most folks, we try to be careful with what we say and how we say it and try to speak in a very prescribed sort of manner. So this concept that autistic individuals or neurodiverse individuals need sort of special treatment or accommodations where you have to go above and beyond is kind of a misnomer. I don't think it's a good way to think about it. Every human being needs an environment that's tailored in such a way that is conducive to learning, conducive to getting the work done in a manner that's not abusive or distracting or stressful as much as humanly possible. So that's the first bit I'd like to tackle, is this concept of accommodations. If your brain is wired a bit differently, then you might need some accommodations that would work best for you that other people, it's not as much of a bother. Take, for example, some of us on the spectrum have sensory issues. And so certain types of fluorescent lighting or something might be too bright for us. Most people might find the lights to be a little distracting, but for us, it could be so distracting that we need some sort of accommodations, like maybe if we can put on some shades to kind of help us deal with it, or maybe in a more extreme case, if we could work with the folks who do the maintenance and stuff and figure out if there's a way to get like a softer bulb or something like that. You wouldn't consider it an accommodation if the light bothered everyone. Imagine that they installed these really high-powered spotlights that were just shining in all the students' faces, and all the students came to class and they were like, "Oh my God, this is so bright, I can't focus." Well, if it was bothering everybody, you wouldn't think of it as an accommodation. You would go, "Oh, these lights this is the wrong lighting for this environment. We need to change this environment so the students can focus on the lesson and do what they've come here to do." So that's the first bit. Is I would challenge you not to think of an accommodation as, oh, this one person needs special treatment, but rather, because this person's brain is wired a little bit differently, and I want this to be a conducive learning environment for that person as well, I need to give this consideration. At the Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation, we focus on adults on the spectrum in the workplace. Over 80% of people on the autism spectrum are unemployed or underemployed. And in a lot of cases, these are folks who would be absolutely brilliant at work and be valuable contributing members of society if they just had an environment that was more conducive for them. Now, among the many missions that we participate in, we work with companies, some of which are way ahead of the curve in integrating neurodiverse talent into the workforce. And a lot of the supervisors who have become very successful at working with their neurodiverse employees, one of the strategies that they use to be successful is they're very mindful of their language. Take autism, for example. People like myself have a very literal mind. We hear words, and then we take the literal meaning of those words. And when we speak very literally. That's another way of saying this is we say precisely what we mean. And we can be very brutally blunt, very brutally honest. And there's no attempt to hurt somebody's feelings or something in that case, because this is just how we think. And if you're very blunt and direct with us, we appreciate that. We don't get offended. We appreciate that because that's just how we use language. So for the supervisors to successfully work with these employees and to communicate effectively with them, they're mindful of this fact. And so what does that mean? That means they avoid sarcasm. They put some thought into their words. They say precisely what they mean. And if one of their autistic employees says something that comes across as a bit rude or a bit direct, rather than quickly jumping to conclusions and getting upset or getting offended, they remind themselves, hey, this person's brain works a little bit differently. This person's probably not trying to be offensive. This is probably, they're just trying to effectively communicate. And so operating on that wavelength, just being mindful about what you say and how you say it, and putting some effort to try and understand precisely what that employee or what that student means when they're communicating to you in such a blunt, direct manner can be tremendously beneficial and can help avoid a lot of miscommunication. And I would say for a lot of us on the spectrum, especially those of us who are able to go to college and able to take classes and stuff, miscommunication is the number one thing that keeps that 80% unemployment percentage as high as it is. So that's another good tip to consider. If you're working with anyone who they just seem to be acting in an unusual manner, they have an unusual manner of speaking, or they have an unusual manner of wordplay or language, and maybe they're very blunt and maybe they're very direct. The biggest mistake we often make is we see somebody who says something rude and we think, well, what type of person would I be if I said something rude like that? Oh, I would be doing that intentionally. The only way I could be that rude is if I was a monster or if I was a colossal jerk. Therefore, that person must be a colossal jerk. And then we get angry at them. I submit to you, that's a bad habit to have. This assumption that everybody sees the world the way you do and their brain processes the world the way you do. Now, sometimes in life, we have people who really are jerks, who really are trying to hurt one another. And we should respond to them appropriately, certainly. I'm just arguing that you don't jump to that conclusion. Ask some follow-up questions. Be a little blunt and be a little direct. Chances are, if you're working with a neurodiverse individual, they don't mean to be rude or they don't mean to be direct. And if you have an honest and forthright conversation with them, you can kind of come to a better understanding of, oh, this is where this person's coming from. This is why this person is using this language this way. And so instead of suffering from a misunderstanding to where you and this other person are no longer on the same page, try to get on the same page. And it's tremendously beneficial. The supervisors that I've talked to who have become very successful supervisors of working with neurodiverse folks, one of the things I most common hear from them is they're amazed at how easy it is. Once you understand where someone's coming from and you have a basis for dialogue, for conveying and exchanging information and getting on the same page, they find it's actually very, very simple once you cross that threshold. And they often marvel to me, when I first got into this, I was afraid it was going to be this big complex thing and I would struggle to kind of figure out what sort of page this person's on. But once I got used to it, it was actually turned out to be much simpler than I feared. And so my final point for this video is the concept of a point person. And what do I mean when I say point person? So if you're a professor and you have some neurodiverse students, and you almost certainly do whether you realize it or not, and you're having challenges working with them, it's a lot to ask that these professors who already have a very busy schedule also become experts in neurodiversity. That's a really big ask. They really don't have the time to kind of do a deep dive and become experts on all the different ways that the mind works. So, what do they do when they come across a situation where they have someone that they suspect could be neurodiverse and they're having some challenges with that student in the classroom or that student being successful? So I would argue a really good solve for that is to designate a point person at your university. So if you're a professor watching this, maybe you reach out to the HR department, student accommodations, whichever institution kind of would be the best logical fit for that. And you ask them, do you guys have a point person for neurodiversity working with neurodiverse students. Now, a lot of universities, a lot of institutions do not. But I would then submit to you, encourage them to watch this video. And now for this next part, I'll be speaking directly to the folks in that department. And I would say to you, talk amongst yourselves. Find someone who'd be interested in going, yeah, I'll take on that mantle. I'll become the point person. I'll become the expert on neurodiversity. And they don't have to be an expert already. If they're passionate about it and they're intellectually curious about learning more, there are lots of ways that we can help you become that point person. You know, one of the first steps you can do is you can reach out to us. And I've got my website right here. You can reach out to us and contact us at the Frisch Center. We would be happy to get you some training modules. We would be happy to have some conversations and do some training and kind of help you kind of understand. And not just, if we don't have the answer to the question ourselves, we have whole teams of experts that study all the different facets of neurodiversity. You know, in some ways there are a lot of common threads, and in some ways things are very different. I've spoken a lot today about autism, but there are other types of neurodiversity, such as ADHD and dyslexia. There are whole fields that traditionally we think of these as disabilities. We think of, take dyslexia, for example. When you think of dyslexia, a lot of people think, oh, these people, the letters kind of mix up on them. They have difficulty reading sometimes. That's a real disability that somehow makes them lesser than everyone else. I submit to you, that's the wrong way to think about it. Some of the smartest people I know are extremely dyslexic. I know some physicists who are absolutely brilliant and insightful, and they have amazing, talented minds, and they do really good research. And they're so dyslexic that yeah, it is a struggle for them. But they have some cognitive weaknesses. They also have a lot of cognitive strengths. There's a lot of cognitive strengths out there. People who are neurodiverse are not worse than everyone else. They're not better than everyone else. They're just different. So we would be happy to help you. And it would be tremendously valuable to your institution if the next time a professor has someone that they feel is neurodiverse, that they go, oh, I'll just come talk to you. I'll reach out to you. You're my point person. It emboldens them to try and tackle the issue ethically without putting a lot of pressure on them to learn a bunch of things that they, quite frankly, don't have time to learn. And you can be that point person, even if you yourself are not yet an expert, because we can help you learn that stuff, and we can always be a resource to you. So if someone contacts you, if you've received some training and stuff, and someone contacts you with an issue that you don't feel comfortable talking about or giving advice about, you can say, well, let me get back with you. Let me check some of my sources. And then reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you with that. In fact, we've done that for a few universities. We're also in the process of trying to do that right here at Vanderbilt University to try and help them better accommodate. So yeah, that's my final bit of advice is, encourage your institution to designate a point person, get that department to start talking about that, and then when you've got one selected, please have them reach out to us. We'd be happy to try to help in whatever way we can. Thank you.